You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Bienvenue. What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we're going to do some opinion scholarship. Going to go back to the land of ancient Hellas. We're going to talk about the Greeks again today. I thought I was done for that with that for a little while, since we spent so much time on the pre-Socratics and the Neoplatonics. We did a bunch of stuff on it. I thought I would probably not revisit it for a while. But then serendipitously, I was reading a book. Where is it? Right here. It's called The Greek Myths by Robert Graves. And Robert Graves was a poet, as I recall, but he did a tremendous amount of legwork to go through classical sources and reconstruct myths. So it just became really fascinating to me, and it actually started to unfold a lot like the episode we did on Dionysus. It was almost like walking through the historical evolution of the myth of Dionysus and how it spread across time and space. And the story was like really easy to follow. And when I was reading this book, it basically unfolded in a really similar way. But in this case, the myths that I'm focusing on are the creation stories, the stories about how the ancient Greeks believed the universe came into being. And there's many of them that Robert Graves reconstructs in this book. And like I said, the story really seemed to flow so well together with these various creation myths. I was like, let's spin this one just like we did the Dionysus story. So that's what I want to do for you today. As you guys know, the creation accounts are my favorite myths of all. I think when it comes to the idea of God, that notion of a creator is, I think, the centrally important theme. So when we're talking about creation myths, I think it tells us, like, more than any other myths about how the people see God and their relationship to God. You know, what is it to be a human being? What do they think God is? What do they think the world is, and how they fit into it? So this is really, I think, if you had no other myths, this would be good enough, better even, in some ways. So let me just jump right in. Do you remember our episode on the Greek god Dionysus from last season? We started with the classical Greek myth about his origin, which comes down to us from the likes of Hesiod and Euripides. So we're talking about with Hesiod 700 BC-ish, with Euripides 450 BC. So these are, as far as the written accounts go, these are very early accounts. In that tale, Zeus impregnates the princess Semele, if you remember. And then, of course, when his wife Hera finds out, she's none too happy, and that's her pattern, she destroys Semele in a jealous rage, right? Semele is a mortal princess, you know, or otherwise. She's a mortal. She shouldn't be sleeping with Hera's husband. So so she goes down and destroys her in a jealous rage. And Zeus miraculously saves the unborn child that Semele was carrying. So that's Dionysus. Hera comes down and kills her. Zeus sort of miraculously removes the child from her and plants the child in his own thigh. So if you remember, Dionysus was called the twice-born and the thrice-born because of the Greek myth that we're talking about and the earlier Orphic myth from Thrace. So he has stories about being reborn. He's the dying and reborn god, which is why many people relate the story of Dionysus to other mythological stories like the one about Jesus or Osiris or what have you. So Zeus sews the baby while it's still incubating into his leg, his thigh. And so the baby can continue to grow until it's ready to be born, and it's born then from Zeus. So Dionysus is the twice-born god because he was born once from Semele and once from Zeus. Okay, but then we learned that myth was of a fairly late date when compared to the evidence of Dionysus worship in the archaeological record. So there has to be more to this story. And from there, if you remember, we learned about the Thracian Dionysus. He's called by other names like Zalmoxis and Sabazius. whose myth extends so deep into history that we can't even say how far back it goes. It's a mystery, but certainly far older than the myth that we just discussed. Now, this older myth, this Thracian Orphic myth, it's not unlike the Greek version, but it does have differences. In this more ancient version of the myth, Dionysus is born from Zeus and Persephone, and is not killed by Hera, but by the Titans. He is not reborn from Zeus's thigh, but by Athena, who saves the baby's heart and uses it to impregnate Semele so that the child can be born again. Now, I want to say for a second here that this older myth has Dionysus as the son of Zeus and Persephone, not Zeus and Semele. Excuse me. So, Zeus, of course, God, and Persephone, a goddess. And the original myth, it was Zeus the god and Semele the mortal. And there's more to this story. If you go back and listen to the Dionysus episode, you'll see that. But the reason I want to focus on this older story about Dionysus being born from Zeus and Persephone is because Persephone is referred to in Greek by another name, Kore. And Kore means virgin. So Persephone is like a virgin goddess. And the reason I want you to know that is because it's going to be important to the story. The word Kore in Greek is related to the name of a goddess named Cybele from Anatolia, from Turkey. So Persephone is related, at least linguistically, to this much, much more ancient goddess, Cybele, who we're going to talk about today. So central to this story, the creation story, as well as this story about Dionysus. All right, so what we ended up with, all things considered, when we look at this Dionysus myth, or multiple myths, is a myth that transformed from its earliest beginnings in Asia to its penultimate expression in the Olympian pantheon. Dionysus changed, his name changed, his attributes changed, his myth changed. But you can see the breadcrumb trail that connects them. Now, what causes such changes? Time, of course, distance. As these myths spread from their origins through the trade routes and into new lands, they pick up details, they lose others, like a millennia-long game of telephone. Knowing full well how quickly ideas become distorted in a game of telephone, imagine for a second how much more so when dramatic changes in culture are occurring. Invasions, conquests, cultural intermixing, the rise of agriculture, the rise of civilization. You see what I mean? Imagine how different our cherished myths become in situations such as this. And this, of course, was characteristic of the last 10,000 years of human existence, probably longer. So, what I'd like to do today is something like we did with the myth of Dionysus. But this time I want to look at my favorite category of myth, the creation myth. Today we'll explore the creation myths of the ancient Greeks and see what breadcrumb trails might appear for us to follow. Just how far back can we trace the Greek creation myth? Now, before we begin, I want to set the stage by introducing an idea. This idea is called Old Europe. Many scholars use that term to describe the culture that prevailed in Europe, that thrived in the Stone Age and the Copper Ages, but began to dissolve by the Bronze Age. When various tribes began to migrate from Central Europe, both north and south into the Mediterranean area and onward into Persia and India, this Old Europe cultural complex, as it's called, is thought to have been surprisingly uniform. In spite of the distance between settlements and the many thousands of years over which it prevailed. What archaeologists discover when researching these sites include, famously, these goddess figurines, these clay and carved figurines of goddesses. We also find evidence of an undeciphered written script. Some people call it proto-writing or pre-writing, but there was certainly some sort of writing system involved in the Old Europe cultural complex. And this spreads across vast amounts of space. Like, it's really strange, actually. There's connections between some of the proto-writing that you see in places like Crete and then in Eastern Europe, as an example. Now, they also find decorative artifacts of all kinds made of gold and ceramic and copper. There's all kinds of things they find. But conspicuously absent are evidence of large-scale warfare or even defensive structures around their settlements. Okay, now all of this led the famous anthropologist Maria Gimbutas to conclude that a vast cultural complex was pervasive throughout European prehistory, which was matrilineal, if not fully matriarchal, and revolved around the idea of a great mother goddess as the source of life, fertility, and creation itself. Now, if you don't know these words, I'm tossing around these anthropological words. Matrilineal simply means that the family is tracked through the mother, through the female side of the family. So in the Western world, I marry my wife, she takes my name, and our kids are going to have my last name. So that's patrilineal, that is following the male. This old Europe culture seems to have been matrilineal and may have even been matriarchal, where the women were in charge, in a manner of speaking, but politically or what have you. And I have to say, when I examine Stone Age archaeology, I too see the great mother goddess everywhere I look. From the Neolithic painted caves of France and Spain to the so-called Venus figurines of the Stone Age, our very oldest religious images do depict the great mother, God as the great mother. Okay, so how do we get from a matriarchal society who imagines the divine as a great mother to a patriarchal one with a pantheon of gods and goddesses? One word comes to mind: Arya. You'll recognize that word in a different form, Aryan, which describes a group of people from Central Europe that migrated in waves from the steppe and Caucasus region during the Bronze Age. And these were warlike bands of horse riders, some of the earliest horse riders. They were patriarchal and brought with them their own image of God, their own image of the divine. For them, God was not a great mother, but a sky father. They call him Deus Petar. Deus is where we get the word Zeus from. Deus Petar is where we get Jupiter from. You see what I mean? Slowly but surely, these nomadic horse riders conquered their neighbors, leaving a cultural and genetic legacy that spans nearly all of Europe and Asia, and not only survives today, but remains dominant. All of the Romance languages, as an example, go back to this Aryan or Indo-European root. And that's true in India, with Sanskrit as an example. It's impressive. That brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call Struggle for Synthesis. So let's get into it. When we look carefully at the myths of Dionysus, it is clear that he, along with Zeus, assumed the associations of fertility, life, and agriculture, which previously belonged to the Great Mother in her form as the Thracian earth goddess Semele, which you'll see sounds a whole heck of a lot like simile, and her Phrygian counterpart Cybele. I want to point out again the similarity here linguistically between Semele and Cybele, and Kore when we were talking about Persephone earlier. What I want you to pick up on is this is the same idea with in fact the same name, or essentially the same name, in different parts of the world. Now, in the Thracian area, this is like Bulgaria, Macedonia, northwest Turkey. In that area, she's called Semele. But in the Phrygian area, which is north and central Turkey, she's called Cybele. Okay, so in the case of Zeus, the usurping of the role of this great mother is so clear, it's impossible to ignore. We've already read the story. You've already heard what I'm going to tell you, but listen again. Zeus incubates the child Dionysus. Zeus incubates the child Dionysus. He literally assumes the divine womb from the Great Mother, who was recognized as God all throughout Old Europe. Zeus comes in as an upstart, but basically a new god, and he has to assume the qualities, the characteristics of the Great Mother in order to prevail as the dominant ruling force in this area that used to worship for thousands of years the Great Mother Goddess. So clearly, we can see here an indigenous Great Mother cult which continued unbroken from the Stone Age before being subsumed, at least in part, by a masculine god. Dionysus, in a sense, picks up where Semele or Cybele left off. I mean, Dionysus himself is said to be the son of Semele in the Orphic myth, or Semele in the Olympian myth. Of course he picks up where she left off, right? He's her son, the next generation, her legacy in a manner of speaking. But it's not another goddess that carries the torch, as you might expect, in a matrilineal culture. The great goddess is replaced by a great god, right? Because these Aryans are patriarchal. They see God and their culture as being led by the man. And the reason for this is not at all coincidental. Not at all coincidental. It reflects the changing of the times and the transformation of the culture brought about by contact with this new patriarchal one. That's why this section is called Struggle for Synthesis, because that's what's happening here. They're trying to mix these ideas of the great goddess and the great god and come up with a synthesis that can continue and unify these people with these different beliefs and different cultures and different symbols. Now, we encountered evidence for this subsuming of the Great Mother by these new coming gods. We discussed evidence of this already. If you recall the episode we did on the Sibylline oracles, I think that was last season. In that episode, we learned of the ancient seer prophetesses of the Hellenic world, the Greek world, and their famous temples, which people made pilgrimages to for hundreds of years. We learned of many such temples across Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and the Levant. And in every case, there was a female priestess at its center. The importance of women as oracles reflect their ancient pedigree from the ancient mother goddess cult of the Stone Age. And that is not a supposition on my part. How do I know? Because the Oracle of Delphi, which is the earliest symbol we know of, had been an oracle from even before the time of the Trojan War, from before the Aryan invasion, which brought the patriarchal Mycenaeans or their forerunners into Greece. Even the Greeks admitted that the Oracle of Delphi was a temple to Gaia, the Great Mother, before it became a temple of Apollo. Similarly, the Oracle of Dodona, according to Herodotus, dates back to 2000 BC, maybe older, when it was dedicated to the Great Mother Goddess, before it ever became a temple of Zeus. So here's my question. How did this cultural clash and the synthesis that developed between them impact the way the classical Greeks understood the divine and their relationship to it? The best way to find out, I think, is to look at their creation myths. And that brings me to my next section. I'm going to call this Hellas versus Pelas. You'll find out in a minute, but if you don't know, Hellas is the classical word that the Greeks used to refer to Greece or to themselves as the Greek people, Hellenes, and so their land was Hellas. But there were people that were there in Greece when the Hellenes arrived, and these people refer to themselves as Pelas. Okay, let me get into this because I'm going to start talking about Robert Graves in his book here. As you may have noticed, the ancient Greek religion did not have a Bible. And since there was no definitive, recognized canon of myths, we instead have many ancient sources who tell these tales. And they do so at different times and in different contexts, much like the ancient Egyptian religion. And so their myths often conflict. Stories are told about one god and then retold in a contradictory way by others. Origin stories change, etc. When we look for a starting point here, we really want to access the creation myths that were being told before the classical Greeks arrived. We want to reach back as far into antiquity as we can. But this is difficult. Okay, the further back we go, we run into pre-literate societies where their myths were spread by word of mouth. Nothing is written down and therefore risks being lost forever. But in this case, we're in luck. The Greeks recorded many things which had been strictly oral traditions. So in principle, we could reconstruct these most ancient stories. If only we could collect all the references to them written down by the classical Greeks. And as it turns out, this is exactly what Robert Graves did back in 1955. So after studying Pliny's Natural History, Homer's Iliad, Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica, Hesiod's Theogony, Hyginus's Fabulae, Apollodorus, Pausanias the geographer, Proclus the Neoplatonic philosopher, after reading all of this stuff, Graves identified a tradition older than any other known. He identified the so-called Pelasgian creation myth. Who were the Pelasgians? They were the people who the Mycenaeans encountered when they arrived in Greece. The Pelasgians were not Hellenes. They were the original indigenous inhabitants of Greece. Okay, the first century geographer Strabo suggests, and this is cool, listen to this, that their name may come from Pelgari, which means storks, like the birds, proposing that the stork was the totem animal of the tribe. The Pelasgians may have been the stork clan of prehistoric Greece. Now, additionally, Pausanias, another Greek geographer, wrote that Pelasgus was the first of men, giving us more evidence that these were the original inhabitants of Greece. But when I'm trying to tell you the original inhabitants, what I'm trying to emphasize here is just how far back these people go there. Imagine a tribe of people, imagine like a Native American tribe of people that we would have encountered in the 1400s or 1300s or whatever, or 1500s when we got here, unless you were one of the Vikings coming over to Canada. But in any case, you meet these people living in a tribal society and very close to nature, and you might say in a primitive way. And what you notice there, and you'll see this elsewhere, where people live similarly, like in sub-Saharan Africa, places like that, that the tribal people identify with oftentimes an animal. So I'm thinking of like a Native American totem pole. I'm thinking about the tribes themselves who identify themselves as being of the bear clan or of the fox clan. You see what I mean? This is the type of thing that the Pelasgians were in Greece, living in this very tribal way, going back deep, deep into history when the people in Europe were living like this. And the Pelgari may be the stork clan. Now, Graves suggests that the Pelasgians may have belonged to the Neolithic painted ware culture, which would have migrated from the eastern Mediterranean coast. We would just call that the Levant, but that's the area of like Israel, Syria, that kind of stuff. At a very early date, perhaps 3500 BC, he suggests. The existence of a Hittite colony in the Isthmus of Corinth in 2000 BC, and the Western Mediterranean or Aegean origin of the biblical Philistines provides support for that hypothesis. So it may very well be that the people who were living in Greece originally came from the other side of the Mediterranean. And we have evidence for that sort of migration with a Hittite colony in Corinth And again, with the Philistines living again in Israel, Palestine, in that area. And many anthropologists or archaeologists believe that those people belonged to what's called the Sea Peoples and came over from the Aegean. So we can see that back and forth, that migration was happening at a very early period. All right, now, since we know the Great Mother Goddess cult was a prominent feature of the ancient religions of the people of the Levant and the Middle East, and just to give you some examples, of this Great Mother Goddess character, the Hebrew or Canaanite version is called Asherah, the Anatolian version Kybele, the Egyptian version Isis, the Sumerian or Babylonian is the Ishtar or Inanna character. Very important, fundamental, primordial mother goddesses and creation goddesses. Now we should expect to see the same among the Pelasgians, if they are related to this cultural complex. And of course, we do. Graves notes that the Pelasgians recognized neither gods nor priests, but only a universal goddess. Her name is Irenome, which means wide wandering. The Pelasgians believed in a great mother goddess they called Irenome. All right, next we're going to take a look at Graves' reconstruction of the Pelasgian creation myth. But before we do, I want to give you a few examples of the source material for how these myths were reconstructed. Remember, there is no Bible, so we're patching together stories from bits and pieces from the breadcrumbs left by these classical authors, by the Greeks that were writing about the Pelasgians when they were much, much closer to the time where the Pelasgians were there. These are the most reliable sources. And before I just read the myth to you, I told you at the beginning this was reconstructed by Robert Graves in 1955. So I can't just read this myth to you. I need you to see the work that Robert Graves did to reconstruct the myth, and at least show you how it was possible for him to do that, because it makes all the difference. So I'm not going to go through every citation that he uses, but I just want to give you a couple as we begin here, so when I read the myth, you can see how it was pieced together. All right, so if we go back to the Greek geographer Pausanias, Pausanias says this. This is just a fragment from something that he wrote. And it says, Irenome is believed by the people of Phagalia, which is a city in Arcadia, which is like central Greece, and Arcadia is the area where the original inhabitants of Greece, the tribes there are considered to be the oldest inhabitants of Greece. So he says, the Irenome is believed by the people of Arcadia to be a surname of Artemis. Those of them, however, to whom have descended ancient traditions, declare that Irenome was a daughter of Ocean, whom Homer mentions in the Iliad. So this name, Irenome, does appear in places like the Iliad. So you get some idea of how this is pieced together, but let me read you another because it's even better. This one comes from Apollonius of Rhodes of the Argonautica, Book 1. And he says, he sang how the earth, the heaven, and the sea once mingled together in one form. After deadly strife were separated each from the other. And he sang how first of all, Ophion and Irenome, daughter of Ocean, held the sway of snowy Olympus, and ruled over the blessed Titan gods, while Zeus, still a child, dwelt in the Dictaean cave. All right, so imagine 20 of these, scattered all around different ancient texts. And Robert Graves goes and he picks them all up and he puts them together. He reads through them and he figures out, okay, all these details are here. Let's reorganize this into the story that encapsulates all of these elements. And let me read you that story now. This is the oldest creation myth from Greece. It goes like this. In the beginning, Irenome, the goddess of all things, rose from chaos and divided the sea from the sky. She danced, and the wind set in motion seemed something new and apart with which to begin a work of creation. She caught hold of this wind and rubbed it between her hands. And behold, the great serpent Ophion. Eurynome danced wildly and more wildly, until Ophion, grown lustful, coiled about those divine limbs, and was moved to couple with her. So Eurynome was got with child. Next, she assumed the form of a dove brooding on the waves, and in due process of time laid the universal egg. Ophion coiled 7 times about this egg until it hatched and split in 2, and out tumbled all things that exist, her children, the sun, moon, planets, stars, the earth with its mountains and rivers, its trees, herbs, and living creatures. Eurynome and Ophion made their home upon Mount Olympus, where he vexed her by claiming to be the author of the universe. Forthwith she bruised his head with her heel, kicked out his teeth, and banished him to the dark caves below the earth. But the first man was Pelasgus, ancestor of the Pelasgians. He sprang from the soil of Arcadia. All right, so you see that reference to Arcadia there. And again, the Arcadians are they're in the Peloponnesian mountainous area. They're considered to be the oldest Greek tribe, basically. So that is the oldest creation myth. And it's got no names you recognize if you're a fan of Greek mythology, where we kind of have a reference to Zeus at the end, but he was still a child. You start to see how this myth is intended to represent itself as being so old that when all of this stuff happened and when people told this story, the king of the gods, Zeus, was merely a child. That's how old this is. But notice, Eurynome is called the goddess of all things. Just this is the great mother goddess. She was the only thing, the divine monad that was there at the beginning, Eurynome. And she rose from chaos, right? And this is what we see in all of the mythology of the ancient world. In the beginning, there was chaos, something like that, something like the waters of chaos. Certainly true in the Bible. Certainly true in the Hesiod creation story from ancient Greece. Certainly true in the Babylonian story. And it says that she danced and a wind emerges. And this is a very strange line to me. It said, she set in motion the wind. It seemed something new and apart with which to work to begin a work of creation. So Eurynome is all that exists. She's the one monad that constitutes all of reality in the beginning. And she moves, and it seems to her like the wind she's created is something apart from her. And this is what causes creation to begin. And you can see even in the first line where it says, the goddess of all things rose from chaos and divided the sea from the sky. This is the sort of creation work that's happening. It's a matter of dividing things or separating them from her. She is the all. She's the oneness. So something has to be removed from her, like she's the source and substance of reality. And it's symbolized as a separating from her. So she moves, this wind is separated from her. It's the something new that exists outside of her. And it says she grabs the wind and she rubs it between her hands, and it creates, magically, it creates this great serpent, Ophion. I can't help but say that there's something phallic about that. The snake looks a lot like a phallus, and she's rubbing it, and that sort of a thing. And then she creates the snake, and that's probably a familiar image to you. I mean, you think about the snake in the Garden of Eden. You might think about the cosmic snake or the world snake that's wrapped around Yggdrasil, the world tree from Viking mythology. You might think about Apophis from the ancient Egyptian religion, who would swallow the sun or fight with the sun, and Ra has to fight him every night. There's always in these ancient myths a place for some sort of a serpent god or a serpent imagery or symbolism that has to do with creation. And in this case, it's Ophion. All right, so Eurynome dances. The serpent grows lustful, coils about her, couples with her, and she becomes pregnant. And then it says she turns into a dove. All right, and it says that it says she assumed the form of a dove brooding on the waves. And the reason I focus on that is because it reminds me of a phrase from the Bible, from the book of Genesis, when the world is being created. When it says in Genesis, the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters, just like this dove was hovering and brooding over the waves. You have this very similar imagery. There's also connections, more connections between the dove and Judaism and Christianity, which I won't get into, but it's there. And then she lays the universal egg. Again, that symbol also appears in lots of different places. This idea of a cosmic egg. We see that in the Egyptian myths, where Ra is hatched from this cosmic egg. We also see it among the Vedas in ancient India. And one of their creation stories is about the golden embryo, or the golden egg, the cosmic egg out of which the cosmos comes. And this is what Eurynome lays, the universal egg. And then Ophion coils around it 7 times until it hatches, and it splits in 2. So you have this separation motif that happens again. It splits in 2, it separates into 2. And out tumbles the cosmos. Everything that exists comes out of this cosmic egg. And then it gets weird, right? You almost think the story should stop there, but it doesn't. It says, Eurynome and Ophion make their home on Mount Olympus. Then it says where he vexed her by claiming to be the author of the universe. So the snake who Eurynome created is now trying to convince her, oh no, it was I who was the creator. Now I want to say this sentence here encompasses, I think, this cultural struggle that was happening between the old Europe cultural complex that worshiped the great goddess and these newcomers coming in, right? These newcomers, the patriarchal tribes who have this idea of a god instead of a goddess, they're represented by Ophion, the phallic-shaped snake, and he tells Eurynome, the great goddess, no, I am the creator, not you. And what's funny is a lot of ancient religions have this idea of a demiurge. The demiurge is like a creator god. A god creates the demiurge and then steps away. And the demiurge creates the universe and pretends to be God, even though there's this God behind God. There's this real God. The demiurge is something like a false God who often assumes the identity of God, or tries to convince you that there isn't a God beyond him. And this idea seems to be firmly fixed in this very ancient myth from pre-Hellenic Greece. But it gets even weirder because Eurynome doesn't take that line down. Instead, it says, she bruises his head with her heel. That might perk your ears a little bit. She kicked out his teeth and banished him to the dark caves below the earth. What do you do with the devil? You banish him to Tartarus, into the dark places within the earth. But the reason that bruised his head with her heel language might sound familiar to you is because it's biblical. So let me give you some parallels from the Bible with origins in this great mother goddess cult. So we saw the serpent already, and the virgin imagery, right? Eurynome the virgin, Kore the virgin. So this is all there in the Garden of Eden with Eve, and of course the serpent. Genesis 3 reads like this. She bruised his head with her heel, kicked out his teeth, and banished him. Now listen to the Genesis version. When God is banishing Adam and Eve from the garden, it says this, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? God is banishing Adam and Eve from the garden and basically telling them your life's gonna be full of hardships and toil from now on. And God says he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. That language comes verbatim from this myth. I also want to give you not a biblical reference, but something very like it. This comes from the Pahlavi text. This was from the Zoroastrian religion, which influenced Judaism and Christianity tremendously. And they have a story much like the Adam and Eve story of the first man and the first woman, who they call Mashia and Mashiana. And I want to read this bit for you because it pertains. He says in the Pahlavi text, and afterwards they were corrupted, and they exclaimed that the evil spirit created the water and earth and the other things. That false speech was spoken through the will of the demons, and through it they became wicked, and their souls damned to hell until the future existence. So this is talking about the fall of man, just like the Garden of Eden story is talking about the fall of man. And what happens here, it says, in Zoroastrianism, you basically have the great god, Ahura Mazda, and then you have this great evil god called Ahriman. What Adam and Eve are doing here, it says they were corrupted, and they exclaimed that it was the evil one that created the water and the earth. It wasn't God, it was Ahriman, right? This is the demiurge that you see here, where Ophion tries to convince Euronome, no, I am the creator. And we have this exact story in Zoroastrianism, which predates Christianity. It's attached to a very early period of those Aryan migrations or invasions into ancient Persia. All right, notice when we read the story of Euronome and Ophion, there is no Zeus. There's no gods at all. Only the Great Mother, Queen of Heaven, and Creatrix of all. Okay, now that brings me to the next myth in the rotation. The myth that comes next is associated with the Homeric hymns, but also the Orphic hymns. We've talked about Orphism before and how it impacted the Greek religion tremendously, especially with the worship of Dionysus and the mysteries and all that sort of thing. So here is Robert Graves' reconstruction of the Homeric and Orphic creation story. It goes like this. Some say that all gods and all living creatures originated in the stream of Oceanus, which girdles the world, and that Tethys was the mother of all his children. But the Orphics say that black-winged Night, a goddess of whom even Zeus stands in awe, was courted by the wind and laid a silver egg in the womb of darkness, and that Eros, whom some call Phanes, was hatched from this egg and set the universe in motion. Eros was double-sexed and golden winged and having 4 heads. Night, who named him Protogenus Phaethon, lived in a cave with him, displaying herself in triad, displaying herself as though she's three goddesses. He says night, order, and justice. Phanes created earth, sky, sun, and moon, but the triple goddess ruled the universe until her scepter passed to Uranus. Okay, so there's a whole bunch here, but a couple things that stand out to me. First thing that stands out to me is when he says, the Orphics say that black-winged Night, a goddess of whom even Zeus stands in awe, was courted by the wind and laid a silver egg in the womb of darkness. All right, so you see this black-winged Night goddess is certainly a reference to Euronome because you have her being courted by the wind. Remember, she grabs the wind and turns it into Ophion, who impregnates her. So she's the one courted by the wind. Also the one that lays the egg, right? She laid a silver egg in the womb of darkness. And some call her Phanes. So Euronome is also called Phanes. And this myth is sort of pulling that out. If you're interested, by the way, of the text that talks about Zeus being in awe of Nyx, the goddess Nyx, like even the great god Zeus is a little bit like in awe of this goddess Nyx. That's in book 14 of the Iliad. You can find that pretty easily. All right, it says, Eros was double-sexed and golden-winged, having 4 heads. So this is Euronome. When they're saying Eros here, that means love, I believe. Also Phanes, they're talking about Euronome. So it says Euronome was double-sexed and golden-winged. Now it's important. This is important because for Euronome to be double-sexed, it kind of means she's androgynous in some way, but what it also means is that she is the union of opposites. It makes you think even like Euronome is that which is both male and female because she is the everything. She is the all. So she must include both masculinity and femininity. She must. She's everything. That's why she's double-sexed and golden-winged. Okay. Okay, so knight who named him Protogenes Phaethon. And that's important because the Orphic myth that we'll touch on briefly is sometimes called the Protagonist myth. So you have that language here. All right, now the last bit of this is pretty telling for the same reason that this idea of the goddess Nyx or night being such that Zeus is in awe of her. Because I think that says something about this transition between the great mother goddess into this new Olympian pantheon that's ruled by the god Zeus, the sky father. So even he, the Zeus, the sky father, comes into this world, this old world of old Europe, where everybody holds this great mother goddess as the one divine thing. And even he has to be in awe of that. Even Zeus came from that. Okay, so there's something interesting there. And then you have the very same thing at the end where it says, Phanes created earth, sky, sun, and moon. We saw that exact thing happen when Euronome lays the egg and it opens up and everything comes out. But it says, the triple goddess, this is Euronome, ruled the universe until her scepter passed to Uranus. Okay, Uranus is heaven, but the ancient Greeks thought that Uranus was also this primordial god who rules before Kronos and Zeus have their turns. So the scepter gets passed from the goddess to the god. That is an analogy. It's a symbol. It's a metaphor for what's happening in the culture. The scepter is being passed from the Great Mother to the Sky Father. I want to give you just a couple of the fragments here that were used to reconstruct this myth so you get some idea of where it comes from. The hymn to Protagonist, I told you this is the Orphic creation story. This is sort of like the secret creation story that was there, very, very ancient, but always there kind of behind the scenes in ancient Greece. And I'll give you a little tidbit from it. It goes like this. O mighty first begotten, hear my prayer, twofold egg-born and wandering through the air. Bull roarer glorifying in thy golden wings, from whom the race of gods and mortals springs. Hence Phanes called the glory of the sky, on waving pinions through the world you fly. All right, you hear all those elements there. Twofold, egg-born, golden wings, that from which gods and mortal come. All of that encapsulated in that more ancient story. And even the name Phanes appears here for Euronome. Then there's a bunch of Orphic fragments that were used to reconstruct it, and I'll give you just a couple. Fragment 60, and the reason why these are fragments, by the way, is because the Orphic religion was a mystery religion. It was all kept very secret. So you weren't really allowed to talk about it. You weren't allowed to write about it. But there are little tiny pieces that survive from other authors and from things like these strips of writing that were supposed to be burned in funeral pyres and things that survive. So fragment 60, Orphic fragment 60 reads like this. Time is symbolically said to be the one principle of the universe. But being, simply considered, is represented under the symbol of an egg. From these, Phanes leaps forth into light. The egg and the three-shaped god subsist together. Ooh, you hear that? This is like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, one solution of that is to realize that inside the egg is a chicken, and inside the chicken is an egg, and you have this fractal thing that repeats forever. The chicken and the egg are there simultaneously. It's not a matter of which comes first, is it? And this is exactly what he's saying of Euronome and the egg she lays, right? The egg, just like Ophion, was always in her, right? They are her, because she's all that exists. Everything comes from her, right? So it says the egg and the three-shaped god subsist together because they're one thing. It says, and here you may perceive that the egg is that which is united, and that the three-shaped God is the separating and discriminating cause of that which is intelligible. All right, so pretty deep philosophical stuff here about Phanes and all of this. Fragment 61, the Orphic fragment 61, it says, Orpheus addresses Phanes as the only begotten, the Son of God. He produced all this from non-existing things, making all appear. In fact, this calls to mind in many ways Zeus, of whom so much is said, and of Dionysus, whom he calls Phanes, who he introduced as the demiurge of all. As Phanes, he who makes all appear. And how about fragment 86, which reads like this? And first the sky shines by the divine light of Phanes, for it is said that he has united Nyx to him. Indeed, no one could look at Protagonus with their eyes, if not holy Nyx alone. All right, so Nyx, Euronome, this goddess that even Zeus is in awe of, she has Phanes within her. She's united to him, the great god and the great goddess, as one thing. That's going to remind you of that symbol of the Ouroboros that we talk about all the time, that has its origins way back in ancient Egypt, maybe even older. We definitely see it here. All right, so what does Robert Graves have to say about this? He says that Homer's myth is a version of the Pelasgian creation story. So that maybe that's not super obvious, but listen to what he says. He says, Tethys reigned over the sea like Euronome, and Oceanus girdled the universe like Ophion. Phanes, by the way, means revealer. It says Phanes as Phaethon Protogenus, the firstborn shiner is what that means, is the sun, which the Orphics made a symbol of illumination. And his four heads correspond according to Macrobius. We talked about this once before, but the ancient author Macrobius, he says that this four-headed god image represents this transcendent God, which he calls Yao. Yao might perk your ears up because it sounds a bit like Yahweh, and people like Neil over at the Gnostic Informant channel have made a big deal about that, and I think it's fascinating. But Macrobius says this four-headed God character represents this great God, this high God, Yao, and he describes him as Zeus in the spring, Helios in the summer, Hades in the winter, and Dionysus all together, all in one. So here we see the egg hatched from Euronome and Ophion in the Pelasgian myth, hatching into Phanes. The feminine divine principle produces a masculine one. Ooh, listen to that. The feminine divine principle produces a masculine one. So the myth is not saying, is not reflecting, let's say, the reality of a tribe coming into an old European culture and killing everybody and forcing their patriarchal culture and religion onto them, which is what many people insist is had to be the case. That's not what the myth says. The myth says that the divine feminine principle, Euronome, the great goddess, produces the God that replaces her. The God is her son, the Son of God. So that's how the myth tells the story. It doesn't reflect some sort of violent forcing of cultural change by a more powerful people. It's not what it says. It's a synthesis where the great mother goddess is embraced as the origin of the great God. But this is not just any God. It is the transcendent and highest. It is four gods in one: Zeus, Helios, Hades, and Dionysus. Now, you might ask what that means. Like, Zeus is the king of the gods and the source of all things. That's how he's seen. Helios is the sun. Hades is the spirit realm, the realm of the dead, or the realm of spirit. And Dionysus is the force of life, that which makes you alive, that which makes the grapes grow, that which makes, the spring return. All of these things together, wrapped into one. Now, many of those qualities are, traditionally attached to a goddess, the fertility and agriculture and life and birth and all that stuff. But you see it here encapsulated in this Dionysus component of this fourfold god, Yao. The symbolism has changed subtly, but not incongruously. The Divine Mother remains the origin and source of all things, but the emphasis changes, now to the masculine god, which she has given rise to and to whom she symbolically passes her torch. Graves makes this point in the last line of his reconstruction where night's scepter is passed to Uranus, from the goddess to the god. Now, before we go further, I want to interject one thing, because I feel like I have to. I can already feel the tension from the liberals in the audience who hear me and take what I'm saying to be an admonishment of the patriarchy. This is not what I'm doing. I do not actually see the transformation of these myths to be some kind of intentional burying of the feminine beneath a usurping masculine cultural dominance. I don't think this was a socio-political power game, but rather a development in psychology. As Carl Jung and other depth psychologists have already laid out in detail, our myths really are a reflection of our collective understanding of ourselves, of our own psyche. So the stories we tell in our myths are really stories about ourselves. As our understanding evolves, so do our myths. These are analogies for helping us to understand the parts of us that we are not yet consciously aware of. And so it makes sense that our earliest myths, that our myths of creation, are actually analogies to our own origins. From the perspective of depth psychology, our origin is the unconscious. This is the thing that gives rise to consciousness, to us. The unconscious, therefore, is the great mother. She is chaos, powerful, unpredictable, creative. And what does this great mother give birth to? To her opposite, that which completes, her other half. This is consciousness. He is order to her chaos. So of course the goddess bears a god. Of course the unconscious gives rise to consciousness. This is reflected in our myths at the deepest level. It is symbolized by the union of heaven and earth, as the goddess Isis holding her baby Horus, as the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus. You see my point? The goddess gives birth to the god, passes the torch to the god. And that brings me to the Olympian creation myth, which is short and sweet. It goes like this. At the beginning of all things, Mother Earth emerged from chaos and bore her son Uranus as she slept. He showered fertile rain upon her, and she bore grass, flowers, and trees, with the beasts and birds proper to each. So that myth was reconstructed largely from Homer's Odyssey, but also Apollodorus and Pindar. At the beginning of all things, Mother Earth, the great mother goddess, emerges from chaos and bore a son, Uranus. As she slept, Uranus fertilizes her, and everything is born from it. This is the idea. Uranus is taking pride of place here because he's the one that's responsible for fertilizing. But understand, he wasn't there first, and he wasn't by himself, and he couldn't have done it by himself. He needed Mother Earth first. So this patriarchal myth of Uranus gained official acceptance under the Olympian religious system. So this is firmly Aryan, firmly patriarchal at this point. He says Uranus, whose name came to mean the sky or the heavens, seems to have won his position as first father by being identified with the god Varuna. This is one of the Aryan male trinity gods. There's three primary gods in the Aryan religion. But his Greek name, listen to this, but his Greek name is a masculine form of Urana, which means queen of heaven, queen of the mountains. Uranus comes from Urana, the great goddess, right? It says Uranus' marriage to Mother Earth records an early Hellenic invasion of northern Greece, which allowed Varuna's people, the Aryan people, to claim that he had fathered the native tribes he found there. How? By acknowledging him to be Mother Earth's own son and heir. So Graves points out, we have here a patriarchal myth with the god Uranus, heaven, in the highest place. This is appropriate for a patriarchal society. But notice how Mother Earth and chaos still hold the place of ultimate origin in the story. The Pelasgian matriarchy is preserved. It is not buried or obscured. It is, however, reimagined. The great mother goddess that gave way to Uranus is nothing but a reimagining of the goddess Urana. She is reimagined as a god, and that reimagining is symbolized by the marriage or union of Uranus with Mother Earth, of heaven and earth, of God and goddess. The god does not usurp the goddess exactly. They become one. Just as we saw in the Orphic myth, where Yao was simultaneously 4 deities. They become one. That's the synthesis. And that brings me to my conclusion. There was a dramatic synthesis of religious traditions that took place when the great mother goddess worshipping culture of old Europe and prehistoric Asia merged with the patriarchal tribes from Central Europe. To be sure, some of this synthesis was violent, but some of it was voluntary and mutual, driven by trade, migration, and marriage. It is clear that the transition was not an all-out subjugation, for if it had been, the myth central to the great mother goddess cult would have been stomped out, erased. This was not the case. We've already seen how the great mother was preserved in the creation myths as they evolved over time. She was not discarded, but kept in pride of place at the beginning of each creation account. She is the chaos, the dark, and the great goddess who pre-existed and is pregnant with all things. Even when the god appears in the story, she is preserved as the mother of the god, or as his primordial origin. He could not exist without her. Full stop. To send this point home, I want to share a line from the classical Greek creation myth preserved by Hesiod. In his Theogony, Hesiod says, quote, "First chaos came to be, next wide-bosomed earth, the ever-sure foundations of all the deathless ones who hold the peaks of snowy Olympus." Did you catch it? Let me read it again. First chaos came to be, next wide-bosomed earth, the ever-sure foundation of all the deathless ones. Did you see? The great goddess remains the first, even in this myth of the sky father Zeus and his Olympians. And not just this, but she stands as the very foundation of all the deathless ones. She is the foundation of all the gods. The foundation. Without the Great Mother, there is no Zeus. There is no creation. Does this sound like the message of a patriarchal religion that wants to erase the feminine principle from their culture? Or does it sound like a synthesis of God and goddess into a unity that preserves and respects the legacy that gave it rise? I'll let you decide.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.